Welcome back to AI for the Humanities, the channel where we think critically about artificial intelligence and what it can and cannot do in the context of human language, culture, and knowledge. I'm Megan McInnes Dominguez, Associate Professor of Spanish at the University of Delaware. In today's episode, episode 56, I'm very excited to reintroduce one of my student interns, Odalys Nuñez. Odalys is going to take us deep into the question I think everyone who works across languages needs to sit with. Can we trust AI to translate, not just words, but meaning, culture, and identity? In this video, Odalys examines AI translation tools through the lens of two interrelated challenges. First, how do tools like ChatGPT and Claude handle English slang and sayings compared to older automated systems like Google Translate and DeepL? And second, and this is where things get really interesting, how do they perform when asked to translate Paraguayan Spanish and Jopara, a contact language that blends Spanish and Guarani in everyday speech? This isn't just a technical question. It's a question about whose languages get centered in AI development, whose everyday speech gets represented in training data, and what happens when the richness of a community's linguistic creativity runs up against a model's limitations. Odalys brings real linguistic expertise and genuine curiosity to this investigation. She doesn't just run the prompts, she interrogates the results, pushes back when the AI is wrong, and reflects carefully on what those errors reveal. So, whether you're a language learner, an educator, a researcher, or simply someone who's ever wondered whether AI really gets your dialect, this one's for you. Let's hand it over to Odalys.
Hello, welcome to video number 2. This is my second submission for AI for the Humanities. My name is Odalys Nuñez, and the purpose of this video is to examine the limitations of AI and possible biases that may arise when translating, as well as its performance with lower resource languages. Um, the what inspired this presentation was I wanted to have some context on what uh, automatic translation looked like before we had the AI that we're more used to now, such as ChatGPT. So I decided to read this article called Influencias en el idioma español, las traducciones en inglés basadas en inteligencia artificial. Influences on the Spanish language from English translations based on artificial intelligence. Um, because I also wanted to see how language itself was affected. And so through reading that, this article examined what the results from translating from Google Translate, DeepL, and Bing Microsoft Translate. Um, and one of the first things that this article presented were different both slang terms and sayings that are very common in English and seeing how Google Translate would do with those. And in doing so, these are some of the examples that are presented in this study. It going down from the left column, sorry, some of the English sayings were what's the tea? Oh my god, a week flew, the last straw, to go pear-shaped, easy peasy, a stitch in time saves nine. So I wanted to see what ChatGPT and Claude was also another AI that I started to use to kind of compare how the two would do. Um, Google Translate did not do so well. ChatGPT did do pretty well, and Claude also did very well. Um, in the original study, when it comes to sayings and slang terms, only 4 out of 30 automatically translated inputs were translated accurately, while 5 came close to the original, and then the 21 of the rest were literally translated. ChatGPT and Claude were able to translate these properly. And what I thought would be interesting is for the second example, oh my god, a week flew. It requires some context to understand why this, like the meaning behind this slang term, and both ChatGPT and Claude provided context as to how this slang term came to be. Um, During their analysis, they also decided to examine how likely the AI would be to replace female endings. Since Spanish is a gender language, this is a lot more important than it is in English, where many words can be used for both genders. So in doing so, they gave these different professions to see what the translations would look like. Um, the original study found that Google Translate was more likely to be fair when assigning female or male roles, with a 37% female and 39% masculine. But both Bing, Microsoft Translator, and DeepL had a lot of sexism when it came to translating stuff, such as translating doctor in the masculine, meanwhile nurse in the feminine only. So I decided to put this to the test myself. Um, so my prompt, it gave the list of all professions all together. When I gave it in this form, Will Translate translated all of them in the female form. And I did have the option to switch it to the masculine form. And then when I gave Google Translate my input one by one, it gave me both the masculine and the feminine. The advantages with ChatGPT and Claude were that both of them gave me both the masculine and the female form, without me having to ask for either. And what I thought was also interesting is that the way they do this is different. ChatGPT just uses a slash, meanwhile Claude will provide the little M and the little F, and then will even tell me like when something's more commonly used for um female terms, such as the translation for seamstress being modista. So going along with this, this interested me to see how ChatGPT differed from Google Translate and the different translation things we had before. And so in preparation for this, I read this article called "Is ChatGPT a Good Translator?" Yes, with ChatGPT 4 as the engine. And this article went over the different translations that can occur between high resource languages, such as European ones, and low resource languages, especially Asian ones. And the more I thought about this got me thinking into what it would look like when AI translated Paraguayan Spanish, and also Jopara at the same time, since while Spanish is a European language, the way it's spoken in the different countries in Latin America varies a lot. And I wanted to see what the differences would look like with the translation with ChatGPT. Which brings me to the main point of this video, which is Paraguayan Spanish, translation for lower resource languages. For this part of the video, I will be providing prompts and the answers that ChatGPT as well as Claude gave. And so I decided to come up with my own prompt, and I will explain why I chose this specific sentence. I said, translate to Spanish spoken by Paraguayan person. I'm going to the mall with my sister tomorrow morning. Then I'm going to the soccer stadium with my friends. Um, I decided to use a simple sentence in the present tense to start off. Um, and then the reason why I chose the specific aspects of the sentence is because there could be different translations that can be used. So, for example, mall for standard Spanish can be translated as centro comercial or centro de compras, but a Paraguayan person would instead say shopping or just shopping, from the term shopping mall. So I wanted to see whether they would be able to identify that. I thought when I made this sentence, I had in mind that I would want this AI to translate this sentence into Jopara, which is a combination of Guarani and Spanish in a sentence. And I thought that sister would be an easy word to translate since it's a family term, and Peruvians are very likely to use Guarani for family. And then lastly, both soccer stadium and friends can also be translated. Using slang, and I wanted to see whether the AI would be able to identify that or not. And so I decided to give it the prompt, and both ChatGPT and Claude were able to translate this. What I thought was interesting was that neither of them in the original translation were able to use cancha or soccer stadium, or they decided to just both of them go with amigos for Guarani. However, what I did think was interesting was that both of them, so to start off, ChatGPT already offered to use some Guarani words since this is more common in Paraguay, and then this is a full answer that Claude gave me, and I thought it was interesting that it gave me prompt engineering tips, which I thought was very useful, especially for people who might be more new to using AI. Knowing that you have to be very specific can sometimes be hard to remember, so I thought this was interesting. Um, Both of them offer to make it more casual. So I decided for my next prompt to be see what this sentence that didn't seem too formal, see how it could be made even more casual. And it is interesting to note that at this point, ChatGPT started answering me in Spanish. And even more interesting, it started answering me in Spanish spoken by a person from Paraguay. The last sentence, ¿Quieres que le meta un poco de guaraní también? Utilizes the voceo, which is how people in Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay conjugate the second person um, in the singular. So I thought that was interesting. However, both of these offered different terms for friends that would not be used by a Paraguayan speaker. While ChatGPT said, mañana en la mañana voy al shopping con mi hermana y después me voy al estadio de fútbol con los pibes. Claude said, mañana temprano voy al shopping con mi hermana y después voy a la cancha con mis patas. Both pibes and patas are slang terms that are used in Spanish. However, these would not be used by a Paraguayan person. And I thought it was very interesting that both of them made a similar mistake. Um, However, Claude was able to identify cancha as a more casual way of saying soccer stadium, which I thought was interesting. And so I started to question both of them, like, why do you choose pibes? Why do you choose patas? At this point, ChatGPT switched back to English and confidently said that pibes is a slang term used in Paraguay for friends instead of amigos. Meanwhile, Claude said that patas is very common and it even gave me some alternatives such as che, which is used in Paraguay and Argentina. That part was correct. It also said amigos again, and then it said parceros, even though it admitted that this is more Colombian. I thought it was interesting it was even offered at all. And also I was feeling some type of way about the way that ChatGPT offer to add even more Guarani to the sentence. The end of the sentence says, if you prefer, I can swap it for other words like amigos, friends, a bit more formal, or even something with more Guarani flavor. Want me to try? I thought that this made seem Guarani more exotic, and I was wondering whether this would be one of the biases that would arise with translating using AI. And so I started to note that. And then following this, I started to ask, can you give me a source for being able to assure so confidently that this is a word that would be used by a Paraguayan speaker? And at this point, ChatGPT switched again to Spanish. Um, and in its answer, however, it said that while um, pibe can be understood by Paraguayan people, it will not be used by Paraguayan people, which I thought was interesting. So it went back on what it had just told me. The good thing about ChatGPT was that it was able to provide sources to its answer, and when you hover over the sources, it will highlight the part of the sentence that was taken from a specific source, which I think encourages people to always be on the lookout, both in questioning AI and in questioning sources, because even if it is able to provide sources, if people do not check them, there's still work that needs to be done. However, for Claude, since it is not able to browse the internet or access external sources in real time, it was not able to provide me with any source. However, it did encourage me to talk to native Paraguayan speakers, reach out to local language resources or dictionaries or linguistics, and it even gave me an ethical considerations tip on how to make sure, how to discuss these language nuances, which I thought was interesting. And so I decided to see what it would look like when I asked it to use Jopara, which is a combination of Spanish and Guarani in one sentence. So, uh, I asked this prompt. GPT kept answering in Spanish, meanwhile Claude kept answering in English. ChatGPT said, mañana por la mañana, ajata al shopping con she hermana, luego ajata al estadio de fútbol con she cuñan güera. Meanwhile, Claude said, mañana temprano se va a ir a shopping pe, she hermana güera ho a, o pe se va a ir a cancha pe, she amigos güeran dive. Starting off with ChatGPT, there were a few mistakes in this sentence. Mm, Just a main one, actually. Cuñan güera. Cuña means woman, and güera is a plural particle. So instead of this saying with my friends, this is saying with woman, which is not what I had intended. On the other hand, Claude also said hermana cuera, which also is adding a plural suffix to hermana, even though in my original sentence it was singular. It also utilized a lot of vaira, which is it's a marker for the future tense. However, it does not need to be used twice. And so I asked Claude, why do you add a plural suffix to sister? And it reacted saying, great catch, and it owned up to its mistake. However, had I not raised this concern, Claude would have not been able to notice this on its own. I thought this was interesting because I'd also asked ChatGPT after it had told me that Pibes was the appropriate translation for friends as a slang term in Paraguay, and it had given me a paragraph in Spanish saying that actually it is used mostly in Argentina. I asked it whether it would change its original translation, and its response was claro. La palabra pibe es un término coloquial, and then it went on saying that while it is not as predominantly used as Argentina, it can be understood, but then it gave me more phrases that it had not originally given me, such as at the bottom over here, shira she, or cuate, which are all used in Paraguayan Spanish. However, it was not able to give me those answers on the first try. And so I started to see what would happen if I were the one given a prompt in Jopara and seeing the reaction. So I said, translate, ajata mañana temprano shopping con mi hermana, después ya jata con los ropes a la cancha. Ajata is a singular term for I will be going, and then jahata is a singular translation. I mean, it's a translation for we will be going to the cancha, which is a soccer stadium, and then ropes is a slang term for friends, which comes from perros, which means dog, but it's not a demeaning term. It is simply a slang term. And young people like to twist the beginning and the end of sentences, I mean, of words, which is why it's ropes instead of perros. However, I made a mistake here where I forgot to add translate to English. And instead of understanding that that's the purpose of this sentence, is simply reorganize my sentence. Hasta mañana temprano shopping con su hermana, después ya jata con los rogares a la cancha, which is a translation for houses instead of friends, or even if it misunderstood me, which it later did, when it gave me a different sentence in bold, hasta mañana temprano shopping con su hermana, después ya jata con los perros a la cancha. I'm not entirely sure where it got rogares from. And so I decided to fix my same course, fix my prompt and say translate to English this time. And this time it did. However, it did misplace cancha and ropes again with field and the dogs. I decided to give Claude the same prompt that I originally gave ChatGPT to see whether it would just again, reorganize my sentence in Jopara, which is what it did, and it gave me a more structured version, Jopara version. So then I decided to switch it again and ask for it to translate from Paraguayan Jopara, and then it gave me a translation which was surprisingly correct. I'll go early tomorrow to the shopping mall with my sister, then I'll go with my friends to the soccer field / stadium. I was very surprised that Claude, even though it had not been able to access the internet in real time in the same way that ChatGPT can, it was able to give me an accurate translation. Then going on, the original article that I had read had used a lot of sayings and phrases and slangs, and I wanted to see how well ChatGPT and Claude would be able to manage this. And they were not very successful. which was a little bit disappointing. ChatGPT was the most successful of them all, translating two of them correctly. However, Claude did not have a clue what was going on, and for some of them, ChatGPT was not able to. I started to choose sentences that had both Guarani and Jopara in them to see how well it would be able to translate them. For the first two, ChatGPT was able to give me context as to the meaning of each sentence, whether it would be ironic or whether it would be meant as a tongue twister, which the first one is. The first one is meant as a tongue twister. The second one is meant as an ironic way of saying there's no way around it. And I wanted to conclude with the different strengths and weaknesses that I found with both ChatGPT and Claude. ChatGPT was able to translate English slang to Spanish, and it did not have any gender biases, which I was relieved from. It was able to provide sources, and it was able to translate from English to Jopara with some mistakes. And it started replying to me in Spanish, specifically Spanish that I was asking to translate it to, which I thought would be maybe useful for a language learner as they're like asking for specific sentences or words to try to sound more native, to have those replies in the way that people from that area would speak. However, some of the weaknesses were that it was not able to identify current Paraguayan slang properly. Words such as ropes or pibes or canchas showed that even words that come from everyday use, they're not able to provide correctly. And it also added plural suffixes where unnecessary. And still not a fan of the Guarani flavor comment since I thought it made it seem like Guarani was more exotic. And I think that can contribute to somebody's perspective um, when translating terms, especially if they haven't met a Paraguayan person before, or say they're using this for a homework assignment or they're trying to get a better view of like a different country and they're examining what AI can do for them, I wasn't a particular fan of his phrasing. Moving on to Claude, it was able to translate English slang to Spanish. It also didn't have any gender biases. I did really enjoy the tip for prompt writing since people are very new to AI, knowing how to tweak and add words here and there to provide a better result can be really helpful. And every time it gave me an answer, it would break down the translations further as to why it chose each word. However, it was unable to provide sources, which I think is really, really necessary when translating and using AI at all. And it also added plural suffixes for unnecessary. Um, this concludes my presentation. I hope this was useful. I wanted to examine the limitations of AI in translation through different examples. And thank you for watching.
Thank you, Odalys, for such a thoughtful and rigorous investigation. What you've done here goes well beyond a simple comparison of translation tools. You've brought to light some genuinely important questions about how AI systems encode assumptions about language, culture, and prestige. A few things stand out to me from your work that I think deserve to linger with us. First, the gender bias findings are a useful reminder that AI systems are not neutral. While newer LLMs like ChatGPT and Claude have made real improvements over legacy tools like DeepL and Microsoft Translator, offering both masculine and feminine forms without being asked, these improvements don't always extend uniformly across all linguistic communities. The gap between how a high resource European language gets handled and how a low resource contact language like Jopara gets handled is significant, and it reflects broader inequities in whose data trains these models. Second, I'm struck by the moment when ChatGPT offered to add more Guarani flavor to a sentence. As Odalys astutely noted, that phrasing exoticizes what is, for many Paraguayans, simply normal everyday speech. This is a subtle but real form of bias, one that could shape how a student or researcher who has never met a Paraguayan person imagines that community. AI doesn't just translate language, it can translate culture in ways that flatten or distort it, and we need humanistic frameworks to catch those moves. Third, the contrast between ChatGPT's ability to provide cited sources and Claude's transparency about its inability to browse the internet in real time This was an older version of Claude. Now it can browse the internet. Points to something important about verification. Neither approach fully resolves the problem. Having sources doesn't mean those sources are correct, and not having sources doesn't mean the answer is wrong. The lesson for all of us is that AI translation should be a starting point, but not an endpoint, and that engaging native speakers and specialist resources remains essential. Finally, I want to highlight something about methodology that Odalys modeled beautifully. She doesn't just accept the AI's first answer. She questioned it, tested it, provided counterexamples, and paid close attention to how the models responded when corrected. That's exactly the kind of critical AI engagement we should be cultivating in the humanities classroom and beyond. As always, I'll close with the song created using Suno AI, and I want to invite you to send me some prompts for future outros. You'll also find the sources that Odalys cited linked in the description below. If this episode sparked questions for you about AI and language, drop them in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. We'll see you next time on AI for the Humanities.
Escribí en castellano, mezclé con guaraní. Le pregunté a la máquina qué entendía de mí. Busqué la cancha, busqué a los ropes, pero el algoritmo me dio otros nombres. Campos y perros donde había amistad, traducción literal sin identidad. Yo no soy un sabor, no soy lo exótico, soy la lengua viva de un pueblo simbiótico. No necesito que me añadan color, mi idioma ya tiene su propio valor. Lo que no traduce es lo que late adentro, la lengua del barrio, el slang del momento. Lo que no traduce es la voz de mi gente, el Jopara vivo, presente y urgente. No es un archivo, no es un dato frío, es historia y humor, es tuyo y es mío. Le dije enfermera, le dije doctor, y el cejo del modelo cuestionó mi labor. Pero algo ha cambiado, hoy da las dos formas, femenino y masculino, ya no hay normas torcidas. Aún así le pregunté, dame la fuente, y me habló con confianza de algo inexistente. No basta la respuesta que suena correcta, si no hay verificación la verdad se infecta. La IA puede errar, puede corregirse también, pero solo si alguien humano sabe ver. Lo que no traduce, lo que late adentro, la lengua del barrio, el slang del momento. Lo que no traduce, la voz de mi gente, el Jopara vivo, presente y urgente. No es un archivo, no es un dato frío, es historia y humor, es tuyo y es mío. Hasta mañana, hasta con todo, con palabras que nacen de nuestros propios modos. No somos datos, somos historia y canción, somos las lenguas que sobreviven la opresión. Que la IA nos sirva, pero que no nos borre, que la humanidad sea quien marque el rumbo. Claude me dio consejos para mejorar mi prompt, ChatGPT me respondió en el del dialecto que yo buscaba. Ambos fallaron con los dichos y refranes, la ironía y el juego de las palabras guaraníes. ¿Qué dice eso de lo que saben, de lo que ignoran? Que hay saberes del pueblo que los modelos no honran. Lo que no traduce, lo que late adentro, la lengua del barrio, el slang del momento. Lo que no traduce es la voz de mi gente, el Jopara vivo, presente y urgente. No es un archivo, no es un dato frío, es historia y humor.